So usually it'll take a couple minutes for everybody to kind of get settled in here.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Anna was showing us her crochet sock creatures. As everybody gets settled in, welcome everybody as well to
yeah, do we need some filler content? I can provide some filler content.
Yeah.
Can you actually see them? So those ones are crocheted, but these ones are like made out of socks.
Oh wow.
So I'm in my sewing studio for those of you who are just joining.
And for the fabric, do you just cut the dye line by hand, or do you have a Cricut, or how do you do that?
I hand cut stuff. I'm like working on a shirt right now that's like this cool ombre kind of fabric. It's like a galaxy. So anyway, I'm excited about that. We'll see. Next webinar, I'll wear the shirt.
Nice. Nice. I used to before Dragon did a lot of sailing, and we'd be at sea for months on end. So I'd always try to knit whenever possible, whether it's watch caps or gloves, or I used to love socks because you have to turn the heel. And it's not that it's that complex, but it's kind of something.
Socks is like an absolute labor of love. I've knit one pair of socks and that was enough. And like, it's just like, why would you spend this many hours on socks?
Yeah.
That one's not worth it for me. But making like, toys for my nephew or something like that, that feels more worth it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a joy of having like 30 days at sea between landfall.
That's fair.
One thing, you've got time.
Scott, you've been getting into the potato masher game.
Yes, yeah, I'm just in a different spot, but otherwise I'd hold up my latest creation. So it's the version, I think it's legitimately version 2, although I call it version 3. And it's, as I look at it, I just groan. It's so terribly inefficient from a material use standpoint, but it's basically like a 5-fingered spider that's going to hold a disc. And then I've hired a Olengrad to help me in Onshape program a Fibonacci spiral with multiple starts. So like if you think of looking at a sunflower or Italian sidewalks, just that cool pattern. And it's unclear how effective it's going to be mashing potatoes, but it sure is fun. And it's funny, they're like impossible to hold, so I have to make carbon fiber nests out of our Mark Forge just to clamp the thing in the vise. And it's always the way, like I probably got 20 hours machining in this one thing, and it's like you hit a button and it kind of goes. So it's not like it's knitting socks. But it's always the last move. And for some reason, I had a bad tool path and it snapped off one of my little feet and broke my tool, which is irritating. But I think because I have 5 feet inadvertently, it's still going to be stable. Whereas if I had like, 3 feet, then it would be like a 2-legged stool, which doesn't work too well. But yeah, I'm excited to see how that goes.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, welcome everybody. Now that we've taken a couple minutes just to get everybody signed in and settled here, I think we're ready to get started. So again, welcome to our live Q&A where we're talking about new product introduction and different pain points that you would experience along the way. So we've got Dragon Innovation CEO Scott Miller, and then Instrumental CEO Anna-Katrina Shedletsky. Did I get that right? Cool. So I just wanted to start off why don't we give some brief introductions. So Anna, if you want to give us a quick intro about yourself, and then Instrumental, we can get started.
Sure. So hi, I'm Anna-Katrina Shedletsky. I'm the founder and CEO of Instrumental. We offer the first AI-powered manufacturing optimization platform designed to enable product design engineers, like I used to be, to quickly discover and fix design and process issues so that you can ramp faster and have higher yields. So our customers are able to accelerate product maturity while reducing waste and escapes. And they do that by optimizing their lines from early development NPI through mass production. We work with leading Fortune 500 brands like Lenovo, Motorola, Meraki, with customers spanning consumer electronics, wearables, automotive, and medical devices. And I led as kind of a little background on me, I led the product design engineering for the first generation Apple Watch. I was at Apple for 6 years. I led a handful of iPods as well, but also spent a lot of days in China on manufacturing lines, and ultimately started Instrumental under the belief of bringing, essentially getting the right data in front of the right people in real time.
Cool. Well, thank you, and thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to your expertise. Scott, you want to go quickly?
Sure, yeah, and also just started really psyched to have you join us, Anna, and thank you, Andrew, for setting this up and moderating. For me, I'm Scott Miller, CEO of Dragon Innovation, and what we really try to do at Dragon is help customers that have been able to build a working prototype navigate the NPI process, everything from DFM, DFA, thinking about the manufacturing triangle, which we might talk about in a little bit, to factory selection, and then ultimately the pre-production phases until there is a product on the loading dock. We've got offices in the US, Europe, and Asia, and have worked with everything from 2 people in a garage with a prototype all the way through the Fortune 50 companies. And it's interesting to see how similar many of them are in terms of the challenges that they face, especially if they haven't done hardware before. So I'm excited to dive into some of the challenges there. For my background, I'm a mechanical engineer by training. Started my career working on a bunch of robotic projects, from robotic tuna fish to walking dinosaurs for Disney, and really got my start in manufacturing, drinking from the fire hose at iRobot in the early days, where I was spent 10 great years and was responsible for leading the team that set up all of the manufacturing for the first million, or actually at this point, I guess it was 4 million Roombas. So a lot of these challenges we'll talk about today, we've lived firsthand. And like Anna, I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in China, just seeing where the rubber meets the road, and yeah, and trying to learn as we go.
Cool. Well, thank you. And so I'm Andrew. I head up marketing here at Dragon Innovation. So I think Scott gave a great overview of what we do. And so if you didn't get a chance, feel free to look through some of the things that we can do and some quick facts about Dragon Innovation. But enough about us. I think as this is a Q&A, we also want to start off this with just a quick poll just to understand who's in the audience. And so it'll help us to cater our questions and also understand what people are working on. So I'm just going to launch a quick couple polls here, just again to see what your role is at your company, and then if you're working on a product. So I'll launch this first one, and then we'll give us a couple minutes or a minute here to get people and their results. It's always fascinating to me to see who's attending. Okay, so I will end the first poll here. I'm going to share the results. So it looks like we got about 45% CEO and founders and 20% engineers and a few product owners. So that's great. That seems to be right up the alley of the audience that we're trying to talk to and answer questions for. So fantastic to hear that. And then I'm going to share poll number 2 just to see who's actually working on a product or just here for more information or trying to get that idea going. All right, critical mass here. So it looks like about 66% of you are actually working on a product, which is great. And then the rest of you are kind of sprinkled in with either just here for education or working on that idea. So this is all fantastic and very helpful and informative for us to help understand who we're talking to and the different challenges that you might be experiencing. So having said that, are you guys ready to rock?
Yes.
Excellent. So, a lot of these questions that came in were, went from the gamut from super general or generic to more specific, very detailed oriented questions. So, having said that, we tried to combine a handful of them or to, save the more specific ones for later on as we get more and more information about the process and understanding the different challenges that you've been experiencing. So again, I'll start off a little bit more generic, and then we'll start going more specific from there. So the idea is to kick it off to either Scott or Anna, and then they'll kind of go back and forth and fill in any blanks that the other person has, either left out or fulfilled their experience through that as well. So I'm going to kick it off with you, Scott. We got a question in here. It says, how often is the information you collect used to change the product design versus the manufacturing process? Is there potential to use more data collected in the manufacturing process to educate the design?
Yeah. So with manufacturing, in my experience, the most important thing is communication. And if you can get bidirectional communication from the workers putting together the product and then update the design to be more efficient or more cost effective or higher quality, that's great. But where we usually start is with the idea that early decisions can cast really long shadows. So if you can spend a little bit more time upfront getting the design solid so that you really understand that you have confidence in the quality, that it's well designed from a design for manufacture and assembly, design for quality, design for X, then the whole process is going to go much more smoothly. So it is important to close the loop, but definitely I would suggest baking it in the oven a little bit more so that it's that you have confidence in it. And I know Anna probably has a lot of thoughts and advice as well. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. Like, it takes an hour to fix something that, could take days to fix in production when it's just like, oh, I should just go in and make those changes in the CAD. So like totally resonate. I would just add that, frankly, any design, when you kind of either get the first 3D printed parts or the first model parts, or maybe it's first prototypes off of tools, like even world-class engineering teams will have things that will happen that they won't expect. And so they start to put those first pieces together literally on the first unit. And like maybe something like collides and there was like there was a mistake in the design and an interference that wasn't detected. And so, getting those kind of first prototype parts and trying to learn as much as you can from early stage, from the first 10, from the first 100 is so valuable. And frankly, like that's, you in the olden days, pre-COVID, when you could go to the line and you could watch someone like struggle to put your stuff together. That was, for me as an engineer, was always like really impactful to how I thought about design. And frankly, the first time that I did that, like, I think like changed how I thought about design, like ever forward in life. And so if you haven't had that experience, like that's something you want to try to get as soon as possible. It's very different than you yourself who knows like, oh, you got to like thread it this way and do this and this origami. It's very different watching someone else like with finger cuts and like a mask, like trying to fumble their way through it just because it's just like a lot harder. So, finding those defects, finding those design issues early in those first builds and being really thorough in those first builds to find as much as you can, discover all the issues you possibly can. And that's really difficult right now with COVID, which is one of the things that, Instrumental and like we're really passionate about is how we can help people kind of bridge and solve for distance, because that's such an important part of the process. You can't just like, kick it over the fence to your factory partner and expect it to come back and it'll be great and it'll be high yields and it'll be on time. Like it's a teamwork process together with your manufacturing partner or partners like Dragon. So yeah, I think emphasis on NPI as being the most important stage, more so I think than production.
Cool.
Yeah, I know. If you've got something, like it's easy to build a million of anything. It's just really hard to build it on schedule at the right quality and at the right.
You can build a million of bad things that don't work. That's easy.
Right. That will absolutely destroy a company and hopefully it could even hurt customers. But but yeah, just getting confidence in it up front. Like the more you can iterate quickly, as Anna was saying, like do 3D printing, but then when you start doing injection molding, that's inherently different than 3D printing and is going to expose other things you might not have thought of, like drafts and rounds, or the geometry has to be a little different to accommodate the process.
Yeah, and like take the systems in the design that are most sensitive. Like if you have some fancy camera thing that's like suspended, or you're trying to do get the water seal right, or you have like a piece of glass on the front of your product that might break if you drop it. Like separate those pieces out and test them separately and get like design insight early. That like, oh, like don't wait until you've built 100 to figure out that like your cover glass is going to break on every single one. Like build a drop buck. And figure that out early so that you can figure out what design changes you need. It's much faster to iterate on a 3D printed parts than injection molded parts and much cheaper if you have a limited budget.
Definitely. Cool. So kind of piggybacking off of that, I'll start with you, Anna, for this one. So we're going into our first build, and it is important for us to keep our product launch schedule on track, as everybody was trying to do. Do you have any tips for optimizing NPI cycles and prevent delays?
Yeah. This is something I'm really passionate about. As a design engineer myself, this was a phase that I spent a lot of time in, but I was also the person who did early field failure analysis after we shipped. So I saw all the mistakes we made. And so that kind of having that full loop is something I'm really passionate about. So if you're going into your first build, everybody's trying to keep their schedule. Your schedule may be too optimistic though. So it's important to take like a very hard look at your schedule and don't assume that everything's going to go perfectly right, and give yourself time to solve problems because they will take time. Not everything will be perfect, and many schedules, even at the most admired companies, are too optimistic. Another thing I would say is like the whole XVT thing, which is, I don't know, for those of you who might not be familiar, like there's kind of three build stages, EVT, DVT, PVT. Sometimes there's different names at different companies, but there's kind of different stages. And sometimes companies try to put it down to only 2 builds, and they'll call DVT and PVT, they'll call it XVT. And I always say that X is for fingers crossed. And so give yourself and your engineers the time to actually solve the problems in the first place. Because I'm sure Scott will say that there's like, you can have the, fast, good, cheap, pick 2. And if your schedule is not well thought out, then you're going to end up not being able to pick that one, or you're going to have to pick that one over other ones. So another thing is really to emphasize issue discovery as early as possible. And if you can find an issue on like the first day of the build, you can actually maybe get new parts and implement and validate the fix within the build. So you're just getting more done within each build opportunity. Software engineers like to think that like, their stuff's hard, and hardware engineers, kind of what I tell software engineers is we only get to push the compile button 3 times, and every time we do it, it costs $1 million. So like our jobs are way harder. So I think making sure you're trying to get all the bug fixing into your cycles. And that can be really hard because the status quo today for finding these issues is really kind of luck based, unfortunately. Be in the right place at the right time. So finding really good tests, ways that you can set up testing that can test 100% of units, being there if you can. Instrumental is helpful in this area, but don't want to plug too much there. Happy to talk offline if anybody wants to hear about that. But discover those issues early, because changing things in the first build is so much cheaper, so much easier than when you have like stuff you've already built that you have to disposition in production. What about Scott? What do you think?
Yeah, so the failure mode that we've seen is that if whether you look at EVT, DVT, PVT, or we might do the other style of is engineering, or first shots, engineering pilot 1, final engineering pilot, production pilot, and then production start. We find companies often will try to, as you said, skip a phase or like leapfrog, and it just, you always end up adding more. I always laugh. And maybe that's the wrong thing to do, but you'll have like final engineering pilot is defined as having a saleable product, including packaging, that's built by a team of engineers as opposed to production workers. And often you'll see like FEP, and then FEP1, and then FEP2, and FEP3. And the first word is final. Like it blows me away. Or
It's like
then
the Word document that keeps getting final.
yeah, but that
Um,
happens. Like at iRobot, we used to do that all the time. It'd be like, final, we really mean it this time. And then, 2 weeks later, you do it again. It's what we find, and it's hard to do because there's always huge schedule pressure. Like if you're a consumer product, you have to be on the shelf the day after Thanksgiving, and that's unforgiving. But yeah, you just won't get everything done. You'll skip to the next step. And manufacturing is definitely unforgiving, that it's better just to get it locked down and have confidence before you go. Because as you said, and it's a lot easier in the CAD than it is in steel.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually like very real costs for not doing this, which I think you pointed out. Not just not having your product on the shelf during a peak day of sales, which like is the season for many electronic products anyway. Is certainly the kind of holiday schedule. But now, like many channel partners, you actually get fined if you don't show up with stuff on a certain day, like Walmart, Best Buy. So there's like actual financial ramifications, and you might not be able to get those spots on the shelves in the future. So there's like a lot at stake. And I think that's why there's so much pressure to try to squeeze it in. It seems to me though that it's better to release a product that's ready when it's ready, and to build in extra time. What we see is, I bet you guys have some interesting data, Scott. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't have it right off the tip of your tongue, but we have, we worked with customers now for 5 years, and we get their schedules at the beginning, and then we compare their actual schedules at the end, what it was. And we see at least a 60 to 90 day delay. And these are all, like, we're working with like Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. Like, this is an industry-wide problem. There's nothing, like, we should talk about it. It's not shameful. But I think like even these, just having more time in your schedule is like really important.
Right. Yeah, we see very much the same thing, and sometimes even much worse than that in terms of delays. I mean, there's the unknown unknowns, because most of the stuff we do hasn't been built before. So you just don't know the product, where after you've built 4 million of them, you know it pretty well at that point, and know where you can take risk and where you have to be more conservative. But then there's also the negotiation with the sales team and the marketing team, where they're like, day after Thanksgiving, we need the product on the shelf. So you got to do that, but you got to do it at this cost, and it has to have all these features. And then it takes, say, 5 weeks to ship from China to the port of Los Angeles. So it's the negotiated schedules usually don't work very well, but there's very real business implications to being late. And I might be wrong, and so I don't have the data, but my understanding was a significant portion of Walmart's revenue was due to fees assessed for shipments that arrived.
For late products.
Yeah,
wow.
It was a great business model for them, but brutal for a startup working with Walmart that is still ironing out a few of the issues.
That's kind of criminal.
Cool. Just gonna quickly move on to this next one. Scott, this one I'll hand over to you first. When is the best time to start engaging with manufacturers when moving from MVP to design for manufacturing?
Yeah, so what we'd say there is you should have a couple of things. You should have a working prototype, so something you can plunk on the table. And it doesn't need to be complete, meaning you don't need drafts and rounds and necessarily uniform wall thickness on all your parts. But it should be more than an idea or what I might call a proof of concept. You should have a bill of materials, which is going to include everything. So if it's a part that you have to buy or make, it's got to be in the BOM. And this includes the packaging, the tape, the labels, the bags. All of that should be thought through. And again, it doesn't need to be finalized. I think the operative word here is 80%, but you do have to have the list of ingredients, the mechanical and electrical CAD, and then also the volumes. So you should know, are you going to build 500 of them, 1,000, 1 million, as well, because that will dictate what sort of factory you want to work with. And maybe at the end of the list, I'll add on what capabilities you need from a factory. So if you're really confident, which almost never happens, you could pick a factory where it's just built to print. You give them the files and be like, just do what I told you. But more often than not, you want to find a partner you can collaborate with and be able to leverage their expertise in design for X or optimization. And that's why waiting or only bringing it 80% of the way complete is, I think, the right point to start looking for a factory. Before that, there's not enough for the factory to want to get involved, just because it's too risky from a time expense standpoint. But after that, you may have gone too far and not be able to leverage the expertise they bring to the table.
Cool. And if you have anything else, otherwise I can just move on to the next one. Excellent. Cool. And then also I saw that there's a couple of questions in the Q&A section. Feel free to keep on typing those in if you have follow-up questions. If we can get to it during the live Q&A here, that'll be great. But if not, then we can follow up with you directly afterwards. Okay, so this one's for you, Anna. We're in PVT and heading into ramp. What should we prioritize in terms of improving quality and cutting costs as volumes increase?
Yeah. So if this is ramp season, or it's a little bit late, but this is ramp season. And the key thing to prioritize is to make sure that you have the data to know what the hell's going on in the factory. Oftentimes, you know, if you're lucky, you're building close by and you're able to be there right now. For many teams, they're not actually building close by and they're not actually able to be there. And so that's really challenging. And so we kind of emphasize opening up the communication channels as much as possible. We help with this in terms of our technology. It's a pain point, which is why we built it, but really just trying to get clear communication across your team with the teammates that you do have in the factory, your factory counterparts, your CM partners, they can be helpful. And so I think having that clear communication and rapport that hopefully you've been building over the last year before we didn't get to spend time in each other's space anymore, that's what you're leveraging. What we're seeing is we're seeing many teams doing some kind of weird things. So just to kind of share a little bit, we're seeing teams shifting their schedules to work night shift. Here, I'm calling from California, and many of our customers are building in Greater Asia. So they're shifting their schedules to work night shift in California so that they can be up and awake and working when their factory counterparts are having problems, or they'll be on FaceTime calls or WeChat groups or things like that to try to stay in constant communication. It can be really difficult though, because there's very few people on the ground, and there's a lot of information getting sent to them. And so the other thing we recommend is kind of consolidating requests together so you're not overloading the people who are on the ground. Obviously, if you can get better data kind of in real time from the line, you can be more productive. And so some of our customers and clients have performance-based test station data that's streaming off these lines that they can be looking at failures as they happen, picking out those units, those serial numbers, trying to look into the test data itself to understand what might have happened, start the failure analysis process remotely. Instrumental customers also get real-time images of key states of assembly from the line. That can be really helpful. Making sure that you've got like clear build reports and updates from the factory so that you have a clear idea what the Pareto is. A lot of times there'll be like one big column on the Pareto that'll be something like cosmetic issues or something that's like a big bucket of failures that someone hasn't gone through and really identified that there could be multiple root causes for. So I think that emphasis on really clear failure analysis and prioritization is really important right now, you know, to keep things on track. You won't be able to get everything. So if there's things that you can catch that cause you fallout, you know, if there's bigger things that you can't catch, solve the ones you can't catch first, because those are the things that will impact your customers. Focus on those, even if the other ones might be expensive because it will decrease your margins. Make sure that what you ship to customers is great. You can come back and you can solve some of the margin issues after the fact later. They're like less urgent. So those would be the types of things that I would think about in prioritizing. Certainly, if you're in a pickle, and you have an issue or several issues, or you need that oversight or visibility, there are companies that can help with that. I'm sure Dragon helps. There's other companies that we work with in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm happy to like help connect people to teams that do exist on the ground that you can leverage to help you. And then also there's technology providers like Instrumental that can be helpful if there's issues you're trying to solve.
Cool. Anything else to add, Scott? Otherwise, I can just move on to the next one.
Oh, that was perfect. Yeah, we can.
Nailed it. Cool. All right, so Scott, do you have thoughts, tips on balancing user feedback testing and when to tool up and scale? Maybe good, low, mid volume options?
Yeah, so again, it all comes back to just getting confidence in the design and the fact that it's easy to change stuff with 3D printed parts versus tool parts. But at some point, you do want to test with a greater cohort. And it's cheaper from a unit price to use injection molded parts than it is to use 3D printed parts. And the material properties are different from typically the geometry or the drop test or just how they look and feel. So what we would typically suggest is you could either do EBT or DBT, or if you use the other system, Engineering Pilot 2, do something called a customer use test, where you'll produce about 200 units. And at this point, you should have pretty good confidence that you've nailed it. But this is just like the final check before you hit the big go button. And you'll take these 200 units, which are all fabricated by production techniques, so molded, stamped, die cast, whatever, but typically assembled by more skilled engineers as opposed to line workers. And they may at this point not have the packaging, but then you'll get them out to your potential customers and try to get the feedback. And you're sort of looking for any big glaring things that you missed before. So the idea is to get a fairly large number. Again, we're not typically talking 20, but more like 200. And then having a structured way to gather the feedback and decide, should we go ahead and start placing the bigger POs for the production quantities, or should we hit the brakes and do a rethink?
Cool.
I would just add, make sure not to forget, this is like a passion point for me. Make sure not to forget to like strife test your product. Like put it through its paces, destroy units. It's really hard in those early days when you don't have that many. Like it seems silly to like, smash some of them, but make sure you do. Cause like life is a contact sport. And really you want to build reliable and robust products that your customers will be able to use and love. And that often means destroying way more than you'd think. Many times as much as half of what you might build might go into various types of reliability testing, strife testing, to understand where your design is weak and where it could be improved. Maybe that's not, if you're looking for product market fit or looking for just like, does the product meet a use case that's unique and new and category creating? But certainly if you're looking towards ramping up a design towards much larger quantities in production into the field, you definitely need a really robust reliability test plan.
Cool. Yeah, I'm all for smashing stuff early.
It's much easier to fix.
Yeah, I'd volunteer for that job. Cool. So Anna, I'm going to direct this one to you. Our engineering team is based in the US and our CM is in China, and we can't travel during some of our key builds. So how are our teams staying in sync and improving quality during failure analysis remotely?
Yeah, so this one's pretty similar, I think, to the question before around if you're in ramp right now, like what do you do? If you're in development right now, what do you do? Because a lot of the finding of issues, at least in my experience, like I went to the line, I would stand on the line for 10 hours a day trying to be in the right place, the right time to see people struggling to put it together. And that's really hard to do right now. I think like the advice that we give, we've certainly written about what teams are doing. And so if you're curious about what other teams are doing, you can find that stuff on our website. I'm happy, if you want to reach out, I'm happy to send you some of those materials. They're publicly available. But in terms of figuring out what's going on, work with your counterparts, try to get that data. And then one of the core things that we recommend to companies is to not think about replacing what you've lost, but thinking about doing it all better in the first place. So instead of trying to replace the fact that you stood for 10 hours a day on a line in China to find those issues and do the failure analysis, think about like how you could find those issues more effectively. Think about how you wouldn't need to go to China in the first place in the future. What would you design that would do that? And ultimately the industry consensus seems to be around getting more real-time data from the line so that you have kind of oversight and constant access to that data. And so that might not be possible in this cycle, but there might be steps that you can take in that direction in this cycle that you can use to get, if you're part of like a larger company, you might be able to use to get over high level buy-in. If you're a smaller company, like this is the cycle you got. You got like a bad lottery ticket for like this being the year that you go into market, and you got to make it work, and your company probably depends on it. And so that's where I would look to potentially work with partners who can decrease your risk. I mean, as a founder myself, I totally understand, you know, the trying to be frugal, but also the value in decreasing risk on your program. That's your one shot. Is really, really important value to get. So if you can find partners like Dragon, Instrumental, or other companies, happy to kind of point people in different directions that can help you decrease risk, that's a worthwhile investment to make. So those would be some of the thoughts.
Scott, anything else to add?
Yeah, I sort of building on that, like for us, we always go back to communication. And in the old days, which wasn't that long ago, just being able to be on the line yourself gives you really high bandwidth. We're really lucky that we've got 15 of our dragons based in Shenzhen. So, you know, we can, for the companies we work with, provide the feet on the ground, whereas right now it's impossible for the most part as an American to fly over to Shenzhen or wherever you're building, it doesn't matter. We find also just having a really clear quality control plan, so you know what you're testing for, and then have built up the test fixtures and the process and procedure to get that data so you can make data informed decisions. Because right now, without being able to touch it and feel it and watch it, it would be absolutely frightening to try to manufacture in the fog without a really clear data stream.
Yeah.
So those are the things we would focus on.
Yeah, you could definitely get, you know, mail is still working, kind of, I guess, but mail is still working, so you can get units shipped back. And one thing that I would say as well is, like, if you're not Apple, don't be Apple. Like, there are things that nobody will notice, that only you will notice about your product. And so think about, are you really, where you want to prioritize spending your time? So you get a great product to your customers. And when I say Apple, having worked at Apple, I mean that your 0.025 millimeter squared black dot on your white surface is probably not a reason to not ship that product. Maybe for Apple it is, but for you it may not be.
Excellent. We might have covered a lot of this, but I'm going to still turn this one over to you, Scott, just to see if we've can fill in any other blanks that we might have missed. But what is the best way to ramp up production from NPI to sustaining phase? Not too quick so that the quality is hampered, and not too slow so the delivery is hampered.
Yeah, so I guess towards that, what I always remember is when I was at iRobot, it was my job to approve whether we release the shipment of 40,000 Roombas every week or not. And as we were talking about, if you are late to a channel like Home Depot, they don't really have a sense of humor for that, and they're going to charge you a lot of money. So if you can release it, you want to. But obviously, if there's a quality defect, the last thing in the world you want to do is release it. So it always comes down to a very simple binary answer. Scott, do you accept or not accept the shipment? And it's like yes or no. You know, there's not a lot of gray in there. And I would always think about that as I was launching a new product or going through the NPI phase, namely, what are the things that I need to know the answers to so that I can answer this simple question correctly? And that would inform all the different steps that we would go in the quality plan so that I knew when the shipment finally got to the loading dock that I could, with good confidence, accept it or not. And I think that would inform where are areas that I thought we could further optimize, whether it's from a cost standpoint or on sustaining engineering, it's generally reducing the cost or improving the quality, and where I could change and where I probably shouldn't change. Because of course, every time you change something, you may introduce another failure mode that you didn't know about, because these things are such complex systems. And I'll give you a quick example. For the Roomba, we had started with one processor, and for reasons that still are unknown to me, decided to switch to another processor. It wasn't cheaper, it wasn't faster, but we just decided to make the change. And we were 3 weeks before we were supposed to release our first shipment of probably a couple 100,000 units. And we're just doing a final test. And we had these test beds that were basically a 4x8 sheet of plywood, half carpet, half hardwood, with a metal threshold in the middle. And as the robots would run around, we started noticing a bunch of them were stuck on the metal thresholds like flies on flypaper. And it was inexplicable. Like, we'd never seen that before. And as we looked at it a little bit more, we realized the Roomba was effectively a Van de Graaff generator, picking up all the dirt, but every electron it could, in fact, 30,000 volts of it, and storing it on the shell. So when they drove over this metal threshold, there'd be a static discharge. It would zap and totally toast the processor. And it's one of these where, changing the processor, for whatever reason we did it, had this massive unintended consequence that would have broken every last Roomba that we ever shipped. So you have to be really careful when you open up the patient and start making changes. And there's a whole process for doing regression testing and making sure that you didn't do any harm as you try to make some improvement somewhere. So you want to take sustaining engineering very, very seriously, because you can improve your margins and create much better quality. But you also don't want to introduce new failure modes that maybe you haven't thought about.
Cool. So Anna, this next one's for you. In your opinion, is testing during manufacture more fruitful at the component level or after full product integration? And does this vary with volume? I think you're on mute.
Testing. Either way, testing. In the beginning, it's probably cheaper and easier to do module level testing because you'll probably need to make the biggest changes. As you move towards later stages in development, when you're building hundreds or maybe thousands, then you have to test the full product. There are things that you can't detect any other way. I remember Scott told a story, so I'll tell a little story about the 4th generation iPod Touch, which I worked on. And so that's a product where we did tons of, it has glass, like very close up to the top. It was the closest to the top product that Apple had shipped at that point, with glass kind of exposed. And we'd done lots of drop testing before we even started the development of the product to see, like, could this glass survive? And we thought that it could, but actually when we put it in the full product, it turns out the full product was a lot more rigid than our test bucks. And so glass is actually flexible. And so it was able to flex the drop buck and survive. But in a rigid product, it didn't. And actually we had some interesting things where, like, if it hit on a specific corner, the way that the geometries actually would move and come in and like and like break the glass. And you can see this in the high-speed video of the drop testing. So you absolutely have to do both. But in the beginning, module testing will be much cheaper. You'll be able to iterate faster. And so doing that can be really valuable. And then in the end, you really have to test at the full system level. But it's very expensive to do so. So you want to be really just ironing out kind of the last pieces. And you can get a good sense of, like, if you're going to have major problems by even just testing a couple of units in that first build. And you can take a unit and put it through a lot of different types of damage to see the ways in which it will fail. Knowing how it will fail will help you make the product better and more robust for your customers.
Cool. Scott, so this next one's for you. What are some frequent NPI mistakes for injection molding and electronic modules in manufacturing?
Yeah, so certainly the thing we see most often is companies just don't have a robust quality control plan. They focus on the cost and the schedule and sort of leave quality for an afterthought. But as we'll start with injection molded parts. So I'm a big fan of doing drop tests with the whole module. And there's all sorts of different specifications, from how high you drop it, what orientation you drop it, what surface you drop it on, how many times you drop it. But the injection molded parts often behave very differently from 3D printed parts. And also with 3D printed parts, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. So as Anna was saying, you're a little less likely to want to break them, whereas injection molded parts are relatively cheap by the time that you've got them at that point. There are all sorts of tricks you can do once you can identify a failure mode, from adding additional plastic, which might be in the form of ribs or things like that, And in molding, that's quite easy to do because it's called steel safe. It's always easier to machine away material or plunge EDM it away rather than having to fill it in, which would require welding and then machining on top of that. So many seasoned designers will actually design a part that may break and then go and figure out where it does break and add the ribs that are appropriate for that. There's also some other tricks you can do with resin in that every resin or plastic has a certain shrinkage, and it depends on what the resin is to how much it shrinks. So ABS, which is a common resin used in housings, shrinks differently than polypropylene. But one thing that I always go back to is ABS and polycarbonate have the same shrinkage because they're both in the styrene family. So maybe I should step back. When you design a part, when the tool maker makes the mold, they'll figure out what resin you want to shoot it in and then make the mold a little bit bigger to compensate for whatever shrinkage it has. So by designing it a part that can use ABS, if you found that it had a impact problem, like it was breaking, you can add ribs, or knowing that polycarbonate, which is very impact resistant, has the same shrinkage, you can do a mix of polycarbonate and ABS. Or if you had to, you could even shoot it all in polycarbonate. There are some subtleties because they have different melt flow indexes, so you need sort of different runners and sprues to accommodate. But just knowing those tricks ahead of time will let you have more confidence in the design and leave some leeway to be able to make changes that don't really impact the tool. On the PCBA side, or printed circuit board, typically you'll have all sorts of test points. So you could put the board on what's called a bed of nails or an in-circuit test, and that will be able to query all the components and make sure the right stuff's in the right spot. We do find some weird things, like if you've done a design and the components are too close to the edge, it's likely the panel saw might come and just tear off the component. And presumably the component was on there for a reason, so it's going to be a problem if it's gone missing. Sometimes also with the multi-layer ceramic capacitors, which are just sort of these SMT components that have a lot of different layers, as their name might suggest. If they tend to crack if they're under strain, and you may want to orient them in one direction versus another direction. And those are all things where on the schematic, it all looks the same, like, but when you start drop testing it, it becomes really, really clear that you have an issue. So again, just going through that abuse testing, whether it's temperature, humidity, thermal cycling, drop testing, aging, any of that is a good way to identify those issues as early in the process as possible.
I'll plug one more that I think a lot of people forget about is light leakage. So like if you have a part inside your product that lights up like a display, you will have photons that come out of that display in other directions. And what you don't want is it seeping through every single crack in your product. So just think about that in advance if you have something that's bright inside your product. And then light pipes are really hard. So plan on having to do many iterations with light pipes, and snaps, also very hard. We'll have to do many revisions of snaps. Do screws. Screws are the best. Glue is bad. Yeah.
Excellent. So Anna, I'm going to kick this one over to you, and I think I know what direction this is going to go, but what if it's simply too time consuming to conduct a lifetime worth of test cycles?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways in which you can age products, usually through heat. By cycling them through heat first, you can essentially do it's a highly accelerated life cycle test, but you can essentially accelerate the aging of the plastic. So essentially what happens is over time, plastic becomes more brittle. So that's why you would do the heat. And then you put them through mechanical strife types of tests. There's a wide variety of different types of tests that might be relevant for your product. If you're building something that's going to go on someone's body, chemical testing is really important. Human beings excrete all this oozy stuff that attacks adhesives, and a lot of these products are held together by adhesives. Like the oils we secrete just like can make products fall apart. You put all sorts of stuff on your skin, like you know, sunblock is particularly aggressive. When Scott was talking about PC-ABS or PC and ABS, I was just like, oh, I wonder if he's going to mention chemical resistance, because that's like something to think about if you're building a product that's going to come into contact with, you know, the chemicals that we put on our bodies. I remember for watch, like in particular, perfume. Man, perfume is really tough because it just eats, the essential oils just eat right into adhesives that you're using to like make seals for the product. So pre-aging your parts and waterfalling together your tests. Well, waterfall means you do a pre-aging step like a heat soak or something like that. You can do that in 72 hours of heat soak, and then you do some mechanical tests off of that. And you can use the same unit for a lot of different mechanical tests. If you have buttons, you can cycle the buttons on the same unit that you like cycle the connectors and things like that. So you don't need essentially one unit for every test you want to do, but you also want to have enough units that you can get some statistical significance, some variation of your manufacturing process to be tested, so you can validate that the design and the process together work well.
Cool. I might jump ahead to this next to this question 12 here, Anna, and just throw in this last tidbit there, because I think a lot of this you just covered. But like, what sample size do you think would be appropriate for that type of testing?
So, I mean, I will admit that as a Apple engineer, I was spoiled in that I could get hundreds and hundreds of units for reliability testing. It's something I'm very passionate about because I think you can just find so much stuff in reliability testing that will save you pain later. And so, you know, when I work with companies and they ask me this, I generally see them taking as much as 50% of the units that they build in a development build. Let's say they're building 100 units. They may take 50 of those and actually plan to destroy those through a variety of waterfalled tests. So they won't just, you know, take one unit and do this one thing and take this other unit and do that. What they'll try to do is have multiple units be tested in each test, and they might have a couple extra units that they'll use if they find a problem to kind of get more of a sample size. For some types of things like drop testing, it really matters like what orientation you hit the ground. And so there's a combination of, you know, doing controlled drop or random orientation drop just to try to figure out like where, like, can you dislodge your connectors? Can you, do you have the stress and strains on the board that Scott was talking about that's going to cause components to pop off? You want to find that when it's easy to fix it versus when you've already shipped tens of thousands of units into the field and have an issue. So it's probably a lot more than what you're doing is kind of the summary, and it's probably a lot more than you really want to do, but it's a wise investment. We work with startups that will could allocate up to 50. Sometimes they might use 30% as like a lower limit of kind of how much they're building and how much they test. Sometimes they'll build an entire build of units just for testing if they have particular issues. The way that I look at it is it's either test them early or you find the issues later and you have to build those units anyway to do the DOEs, the experiments to figure out how to solve those problems.
Cool.
Yeah, and we find it's not entirely true, but sometimes you can test one unit for a very long time or a lot of units for a shorter amount of time. Now in practice, you can't go to either end, but somewhere in the middle. And things fail in weird ways. Like Anna mentioned the HALT testing, the highly accelerated life testing, where you basically shake it and heat it until you get to the point of the absurd where the product melts. But for example, resonance is a weird thing. So vibration is one of the key enemies to products. And I've seen a great HALT strobe video of it was a board with a pretty big capacitor on it. And they vibrated the board at resonance, and the capacitor is dancing around left and right in a way that you would just never see. And the thing basically fatigued off and broke. But as I would look at it before I saw that, it wasn't intuitive that that was going to be the failure mode. And then you also get into these weird things where, you know, in one hand, if everything breaks instantly, that's awesome. If it goes up in a big, you know, flame of smoke, because you're never going to miss it. Like everybody is going to see that. The ones that are a lot more insidious are the ones that maybe 1% of them fail after 40 hours because one, you need a whole bunch of them to even find that failure. And then you have to have the patience to test it and then also observe it. Most people, many of the factory workers would have the best of intents, but would just try to fix it when it broke, but not report it back to you. So just being able to get that data would, which I guess emphasizes the importance of good, clean data, and a lot of data can make a big difference, because a 1% failure for one cause is totally unacceptable for high volume.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
you've got to jump on it.
That's a really good point, around just like to those low incidence failure rates are still much higher than what is acceptable. And so you actually, that's why you have to test so many, is to try to get at some of those lower incidence failure rate items. And they are really difficult to do failure analysis on, because it might be some edge case, corner case of some tolerance stack up that resulted in that. Just as kind of a fun anecdote for those that are on the call that are like in their 30s maybe might remember the Xbox Ring of Death, which was pretty famous, like at least when I was a teenager, pretty famous. You get an Xbox and then like it would stop working and you'd get like this red ring where it like didn't work. And that was a failure to test temperature cycling. Because essentially what happened is when you play with an Xbox, it gets hot and then it cools down, it gets hot and it cools down. And they cycled at a different speed than the actual speed of hot or cold that happens. And so thermal expansion happened differently, and they actually like components in solder joints broke. So it's very important to also have your test. Don't just take a test plan like off a shelf. Like make sure your test plans align with how you're going to actually use the product.
Yeah, and that's pretty crazy because that was Microsoft. So this happens to big companies too, not just startups.
Yeah.
Cool. So we're coming up here on time. I'm just going to get this, I think I'll try to get a couple more in, but we'll see. If we don't have time, just a reminder to everybody that we are recording this. So if you want to go back and listen to any other answers more thoroughly, you can feel free to do that. But the Scott one, I'm just going to kick this one to you quickly. Would love to know your thoughts on maintaining CAD and BOM control when interfacing with CMs. I've seen this get messy in the past. I think you all have seen it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I'm still looking for a good solution to this. I wouldn't say it's a solved problem. What typically happens for startups is they use Excel or Google Sheets for their BOM, and it's impossible to do revision control. The other end of the spectrum is using something more hardened. The one I used at iRobot, which was a disaster, was Windchill from PTC. And this was 20 years ago, so I'm sure it's gotten a lot better. But there, everything was vaulted, and there are so many levels of permission just to change one part that it wasn't nimble at all. Where we were changing things left and right, we'd actually even change it where you grab a tool, stick it on a Bridgeport, machine some feature in, and put it back in and start shooting it. So there's like no relation between the database and the CAD and the actual part that we were building. But I think, for folks that are thinking of, potentially starting new companies, this is an area that's really good to look at. I will say I like the way Onshape does it a lot, which is my favorite CAD package. So with them, they take more of a database approach rather than a file-based approach. So everything is kind of up to speed, and they almost use a Git analogy to be able to do different branches and releases so that you know what you release to the factory at what time. But yeah, it's still an unsolved problem in my book. And I'm curious, Anna, what you've seen out there and what folks are using.
In terms of the BOM, I'm going to leave, you guys are the experts on that. I think in terms of CAD, something that's important to keep in mind is, at least in my experience as an engineer, so not as instrumental, but before that as an engineer, you generally get, if you send your CAD back and forth to like an injection molding vendor in Asia, for example, don't expect your parameters to come back. You'll probably get solids back. And so as a result, like there's a whole generation of Apple engineers that are completely spoiled in that we just do unparameterized modeling. So if you're gonna go to Asia, it's something to keep in mind. You might wanna pick a CAD package that has strong unparameterized modeling tools. They might all now do that much better than they did back in the day. But that's something that like you don't think about until you're in it, and like putting your parameters back on a solid or rebuilding it from scratch is really annoying. So yeah.
Cool. So it looks like we are coming up on time. So Anna and Scott, I just want to thank you for both for sharing all of your knowledge on these important subjects and helping educate our audience here. And thank you to everybody for attending and submitting these awesome questions. Again, we have recorded this so we can go back and listen to any questions that you want more in depth, give a second listen to. And then some of these follow-up questions we'll try to get to and follow up directly. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us directly at help@dragoninnovation.com. And then we can either refer you to Instrumental or answer the question directly ourselves. So I just had one last question here, and it's directly for Anna. It says, how awesome is Instrumental?
We're pretty awesome, I have to say. So if you're really struggling with this idea of, remote manufacturing or manufacturing from home, this is something that our technology is like pretty uniquely suited to address. You can get a real-time feed of images off of your assembly line. We have AI tools that let you automatically find defects, discover them for you, so that you can just focus on the part of engineering that's like that humans are great at, which is solving problems faster. And so that's what we do. We work with big companies, but we also have startup customers as well. So we're not out of reach. If you had a travel budget planned for 2020, we can probably do something with that to replace kind of what you would have normally gotten from travel. So happy to hear from you. You can reach out at anna@instrumental.com or sales@instrumental.com. We'd be happy to show you a little bit more, send you a demo video if you're interested in just kind of seeing what the future looks like in terms of real-time data for manufacturing.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you, everybody. And we'll be in touch with the recording for follow-up. So we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.